Stand by. 3, 2, 1. Quorum Radio, baby. Hey, folks, I'm on today with Charles Brandt. And Charles Brandt is somebody that someone you may not recognize, but you do recognize the blockbuster film, a Netflix film from Martin Scorcese, The Irishman. And Charlie's connection with that film is because of the fact that story, the script, was based on a book called I Heard You Paint Houses that Charles Brandt wrote, which is the story of one of his clients, as he's an attorney, Frank, the Irishman Sheeran, who was a Teamsters official, who became very, very close friends with Eastern Pennsylvania mobster Russel Bufalino, and also Teamster official James Hoffa, who disappeared in 1975. He was a homicide prosecutor, and he was chief deputy attorney general of the state of Delaware. He's been in private practice since 1976. Charlie Brandt was elected president of the Delaware Trial Lawyers Association and the Delaware chapter of the American Board of Trial Advocates. The movie The Irishman is based on Charlie's stellar work, building the foundation of a very, very strong legal career to be able to get to the point where he knew how to cross-examine witnesses and also suspects. So anyway, Charlie was named by his peers as one of the best lawyers in America, one of the best lawyers in Delaware. He's a frequent speaker about the topic of cross-examination. And besides I Heard You Paint Houses, Charles Brandt has some other books under his belt, one of which is The Right to Remain Silent. So without further ado, let me bring him on. But I cannot forget also that he wrote a book with Joe Pistone called Unfinished Business, which by the way, I mentioned that yesterday, Charlie. I gave you a really shameless plug.
Thanks.
Radio.
I love Joe.
Oh, isn't he a great guy? Anyway, so Charlie, you knew Frank Sheeran. Frank Sheeran was depicted by Robert De Niro in the Martin Scorcese Netflix film. How did you get to know Frank Sheeran?
Well, I got a call one day. I was doing medical legal work, medical malpractice, and I got a call one day from a guy who was representing the Philadelphia mob. And he told me that Frank Sheeran, who was the number one suspect in Hoffa's disappearance, and we all knew that, he'd been profiled in the New York Times and Newsweek as the suspect of in the presumed death of Jimmy Hoffa. And he was in jail for 32 years for labor racketeering, but he had developed some health problems, and they needed a medical lawyer to see if I could get him out on early parole based on his poor health. And I did that. And while he was in prison, he read a book of mine called The Right to Remain Silent that you mentioned, a book that is now in reissue. It just was re-released again a little while ago, but it first came out in 1988. And he read the book. It's a law and order book, and it's a pro-police book. It's got an interesting premise. And when he read that book, he sought me out when he got out of jail. And he told me that he wanted to write a book and he wanted me to write it for him. And I knew from my years of experience teaching interrogation that this was a man who wanted to be interrogated. Believe it or not, it's a common phenomenon of those who want to get something off their chest because they feel better when they do, and they really do. Yeah. Getting it off their chest. So he sought me out. He took me to lunch. Said his cover story was he was tired of being written about in all the books on Hoffa as the suspect, and he wanted to tell his side of it, and he'd like me to write the book. And so I agreed to meet with him at his apartment outside of Philly in Springfield, Pennsylvania, and we spent 5 hours together. And during the course of that 5 hours, he admitted to far more than he had intended to. And when we were done for the night, he didn't want me back. and
yeah, man.
And eight years later, he returned. His daughter, Dolores, who appears in the movie, not the daughter appears in the movie, the character of the daughter appears in the movie. And she had taken him to St. Dorothy's Church in Springfield, outside of Philly, and had a private session with the Monsignor Heldesor, and he got absolution for his sins, but he still wanted to talk to me. He still had that original desire to say the words of that the priest doesn't ask. He may say to the priest, I committed the mortal sin of taking a man's life. Yeah. The priest doesn't say, who was he? What was it about?
Was it weapon?
Give me more. Yeah. But he knew I did. So
wow.
he told his mafia buddies in the Philadelphia Angelo Bruno crime family and in the upstate Pennsylvania crime family of Russel Bufalino, he told everyone that I was going to write this book for him that cleared him. In the meantime, he knew that he was serially confessing to me. And we spent 5 years with touring his soul and touring the mob. I got to be around some interesting characters because he was so respected. Whatever he said he was doing, that was okay with Russell and okay with whoever, Russel Bufalino, played by Joe Pesci in the movie. So we spent 5 years.
So I have two quick questions, Charlie. Two quick questions. Sure. One is, sometimes the movie doesn't always get it right? And in this case, of course, the sub-part of this is, do you think the Irishman was faithful to the story that, as told to you by Frank Sheeran? Do you think that was accurate?
Totally.
The movie depiction?
They put me up in Martin Scorcese, Bob De Niro, and the screenwriter Steve Zalian put me up in a hotel on the corner of Broadway and 54th Street. And Marty lives on the other side of the Central Park, on the other side of the park. And they gave me a script, the latest script, and they sent for me. And I spent the summer of 2017, from June through August, having these script meetings with them.
So you were a consultant?
I'm sorry?
You were a paid consultant on the movie.
Well, I was absolutely a consultant on the movie, and specifically on the screenplay, to make sure that it got it right, and they were getting it right. But they wanted me. It was an interesting thing growing up in New York City. When I would come out in the morning at the corner of Broadway and 54th, before I headed to my right to Marty's house, I would look to my left and say a little prayer, because I was looking at a New York Telephone Company building that I worked on in 1960 as a timekeeper. And here I was, these many years later, on my way to a meeting at the greatest filmmaker who ever lived, and the greatest actor, and the greatest screenwriter. And and I would look at that building and remember how, as a 18-year-old timekeeper working on that building, it was my job to deliver messages all across the beams that were put up. And I would have 5 stories below me to my death if I slipped. And here I was walking the beams for $65 a week. And boy, did I have a lot to be grateful for heading over to Marty's house.
Wow. So Charlie,
and they were very...
Go ahead.
What?
No, you go ahead.
Receptive. They were very receptive to what I had to say.
So Charlie,
very appreciative of it. And go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you, what was the neighborhood in New York City? I know you went to Stuyvesant High School. Where exactly did you live? I mean, you don't have to give me the address, Charlie.
Well, I lived in Ridgewood, which is on the Brooklyn. Well, I first lived in Staten Island for 3 years. My grandparents had a little Italian farm, and I lived there. And then we moved to the Brooklyn-Queens border, a place called Ridgewood, which is in which the film was made. An awful lot of the film was shot in Ridgewood, disguised to be Philadelphia. And so if you're watching the film and any of the bricks are orange in color, light-colored bricks, that's the style of Ridgewood.
Yeah.
So and then from Ridgewood we moved to Flushing. in Queens,
sure.
where people had lawns.
Wow.
We not only
You're moving up in the world,
didn't
Charlie.
have lawns. We not only didn't have lawns in Ridgewood. We didn't have bathtubs.
Oh my
We didn't have
gosh.
telephones. Yeah,
Gosh.
I didn't dial a telephone until we moved to Flushing.
Wow. So then.
So anyway, that was my era.
That was your place in Queens and Brooklyn, right there. Now, but did you live in?
Oh, and then I lived in Brooklyn. I went to Brooklyn Law School, and I lived in Brooklyn.
Okay, but you went to Sty High? Were you living in Brooklyn when you went to Stuyvesant High School, or where were you living?
No, I was living in Flushing. It was a 4-year. I spent 4 years in Stuyvesant High School from 55 to 59, and all of those were a nice commute from Flushing. Yeah.
Wow.
But it had the reputation as the best school in the city, and you get caught up in it.
Oh, absolutely. And I remember they were one of the first schools to, I think probably in the world, maybe in the world, to have a cyclotron. It was pretty amazing. Stuyvesant High School.
Excuse me, my senior class. It was the senior class project, making a cyclotron.
Right, but that was, of course, but it was also the senior class project to have a roving crap game, which I think, weren't you in charge of? Weren't you the manager?
Well, it was a card game. I kept the card game going, in our last semester in school. I was the official guy. That's funny that you remember that. That's cool.
Of course, Charlie. You told me these great little anecdotes. I'm a New Yorker, and I love this stuff. So.
Hey, Charlie, one of the most fascinating anecdotes in the book, I Heard You Paint Houses, which, of course, was the basis of the movie The Irishman. There was a secret mafia trial. You attended that with Frank.
Yes, I did. Our first meeting, I met him at his apartment. Well, it was our second meeting. We had gone to lunch first, and that's when he proposed that I write this book. But we then met in his apartment in Springfield, and we were going to work on me questioning him. I went to the bathroom, the phone rang, and when I came out, he was on the phone with somebody and being very respectful. Yes, yes, yes. And it turned out that he had requested a trial in the mob world. When he went to jail 10 years earlier, he felt that these two guys that were collecting money for him on a loan shark debt had kept the money for themselves, and that he was entitled to this. They were supposed to be collecting $1,500 a week, and they give you no notice. He said, you don't get any notice. You don't do it when they want to do it, and look at the respect I get. They only do this for Italians, and they're going to have this for me. And so we went to this trial at the Mona Lisa restaurant just off South Street, and it was loaded wall-to-wall gangsters. And I met Big Billy D'Elia there, who was the boss of the Russel Bufalino crime family. That was where I met him. I met John Stanfa, who was then the boss of the old Bruno crime family. Stanfa was from Sicily. And when he was arrested on 5 murder charges and sent to Leavenworth, I have his Christmas card that he sent Frank. I still have Stanfa's Christmas card. And Frank was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the trial against Stanfa. They didn't arrest Frank. They didn't try to convict him of anything to do with Stanfa's work. But he was mobbed up with Stanfa, and that was brought out at the trial and in the indictment. The mob trial lasted 5 hours, and when it was over, the two guys that he was suing, he was represented by Billy D'Elia, and Stanfa was the judge, and Stanfa's underboss was representing the two guys. The two guys claimed that they had turned the money over as they collected it to little Nicky Scarfo, who was the boss of the Philly crime family just before John Stanfa. And he was in jail. And in those days, when they put you in jail, they put you in jail for like 4 life terms. So Stanfa was waiting his turn, but at that moment, it was a little Nicky Scarfo that was in jail. And they claimed, the two torpedoes claimed that they had given the money as they collected it to Scarfo. And from jail, Scarfo testified that he was not given their money. He was given his own half of it that he was entitled to, but he was not given their money.
Right.
So at the end of the trial, Frank won the trial. He was, the two guys were ordered to pay him $1,500 each, pay him $1,500 a week until he told them he could stop. And then we got to his apartment, and that's when we began our 5-year. We began our questioning, and he gave me far more than he intended, as the book lays out. As the I heard you paint house.
After that decision in his favor by the mob's judges and the mob court, did Frank open a bottle of whiskey and celebrate a little bit? Turned out his favor, right?
Actually, he was drinking. It did. He was, and I say it in the book. He was drinking wine, and that there's an old saying about "in vino veritas." In wine is the truth, and he was drinking at the meeting. And we didn't stop off afterwards. We just went to his apartment, and I picked up where I left off with him, which was I was about to start interrogating him, and I spent 5 more hours. That trial was 5 hours, with kibitzing and all that they do.
Wow.
And I basically sat at the bar, just I could reach out and touch him, but I wasn't a part of it. And then when we got home to his house, the guy that was with us and doing the driving decided to go home, and I had Frank to myself, and I then had him for 5 hours.
So, being somebody who's spent a lot of times in a legit courtroom, what was it like? The jurisprudence of the mob? Did they have, discovery of evidence and cross-examination and all those things, or is it a little bit more rudimentary and formal?
Yes, to all of that. They had already gotten statements from. They had already gotten statements from other people that had relevant evidence, and those statements were introduced. What do you mean you didn't? What do you mean? Nicky didn't get that money. Yeah. He told somebody else that he never got it, and then some character witness would say, yeah, if Nicky got the money, he'd have turned it over. Character evidence,
Yeah.
And they were cross-examined, Billy D'Elia cross-examined the two guys. He did a good job. The two guys that owed the money. And basically he was being a nice guy, saying, you don't want this reputation. You don't want this reputation. You want this to be handled the right way, handled appropriately. And I think they thought, whether we were right or wrong, we're going to walk out of this with a bad reputation unless we give up the money, And and he didn't.
Or maybe decorating a carpet.
Yeah. So they knew, and he knew not to abuse them. That he was going to just take a certain amount and not be a pig. Yeah, I left all that out of the first edition of the book because I knew that Billy D'Elia didn't like me, he didn't trust me, and I gave a very shortened, abridged version of what happened that night. And then later, when Billy went bad, so to speak, and became a government informant, government cooperating witness, then we did a reissue of the book. And added a conclusion chapter of 57 pages. This is a book that just grew and grew as more things came in that corroborated what Frank told me. And
just one quick interjection. This is the book I Heard You Paint Houses.
Yeah,
that had the 57-page addendum of evidentiary material to basically rebut the naysayers of those who said, hey, it never happened. So, Charlie, so you're there with Frank Sheeran in the apartment, drinking a bottle of wine. It probably became 2 because Frank was like, what? How tall was he?
we weren't drinking anymore. We got home, we got to the apartment, And he had toned down his drinking, although he had been known as an unbelievable drinker in his day. After he got out of jail, he had toned it down for a while. In the beginning, he drank more. After Hoffa disappeared in '75, it drove him to drink. But after a while, he was afraid that if he fell, he was home alone and drinking and fell, he wouldn't be able to get up because of his arthritis. So as a function of his arthritis, his drinking lowered its volume because he was legendary for how much he could drink, especially, Joe Pistone will tell you. For your listeners from yesterday, every Thursday when Joe came into town, into New York City, posing as a jewel thief, and he was an associate of the Bonanno crime family. Every Thursday he'd go to Russel Bufalino's restaurant in Manhattan, the Vesuvius, with Frank Sheeran. And just in case,
is that right?
Russell liked to buy jewelry. I'd like to fence jewelry for cat burglars, and he had 2 jewelry stores on Jewelers Row, on 47th Street in Manhattan, across the street from the Fox News Channel. And Joe will tell you that this was right after Hoffa disappeared, that Frank was drinking like crazy then.
So this is fascinating, Thursday. Charlie. This is fascinating. So you're saying that Joe Pistone, under the moniker of Donnie Brasco, was helping defense for Russell Bufalino, stolen jewelry and things like that, right? Or he was.
Yes, he was selling. He was offering for sale jewelry that the FBI had from other sting operations or whatever.
Of course.
And he would say to Russell, "I got something new you might be interested in," and he'd show it to him. And if Russell liked it, Russell would buy it, and Joe would turn that money over to the evidence people at the FBI.
Wow!
And so,
fascinating.
He was trying to. It was part of his effort to infiltrate these people. He had already infiltrated the Bonanno family.
Wow, that's fascinating. Because it now looks like he got more into more families, right?
Oh yeah. Joe was Russell was quite a powerful man, and for Joe to get near him was a big deal. Yeah,
so I don't want to get off. That's a fascinating digression, but I don't want to go there because I have a really fascinating story with our friend Russell Bufalino, who got to know Frank Sheeran. How did they get to know each other? When and where did that take place?
Well, it took place, and the movie depicts it beautifully. Frank was working for Food Fair, the food company, as a trucker, mostly doing refrigerated trucks, selling meat. And his truck broke down outside of Syracuse, New York. And this older Italian man came over to him and said, "Can I give you a hand getting it started?" And that older Italian man was Russell Bufalino, who was not only one of the most powerful mafia bosses the world has ever known, but he was also a master mechanic. He had worked at the Canada Dry Company as a mechanic. And so he got the rig started, or as they call it, the horse. He got my horse started, Frank said. And he asked me a lot of questions about myself, because Frank was, as you know, 6'4", 220 pounds, and easily the toughest human being that ever lived, Yeah. And Russell was maybe 5'4" or something, and Russell took a shine to this man, who it turns out was able to speak Italian. Frank
knew Italian?
Frank knew Italian. He grew up in an Italian neighborhood, and he used to have to fight his way to school. Fight the Italians on his way to school. Wow. But he could speak a certain amount of it. And then in the war, he was stationed in Italy. He was in the Italian campaign, 411 combat days, and in all the major battles, Salerno, Anzio, southern France, Sicily, and he cultivated his Italian during the war. Frank was very bright and a quick study and very witty.
Right.
And so he started talking the Sicilian dialect to Russel Bufalino.
And Russell
And so
was
Russel-
of Sicilian descent?
Yes, he was a Sicilian, and Catania was the town that he was from, his family. And Frank had been in Catania during the war. And he said Russell loved when I described the Italian method of letting the spaghetti dry out. You put it on the clotheslines. And that's the way they did it in Catania. That's not the way they did it in Philly, you know. And so that appealed to, and then Frank began to pick up side jobs. You know, go to New Jersey. This guy owes me, you know, $1,000 or whatever, and bring, and he's slow in paying it. So bring him to me. Bring him back to me. And Frank would do stuff like that, and it's literally, and it's depicted in the movie. You see him get in the car, get in the car. He tells the guy.
Who's going to say no to Frank Sheeran?
Mincy and I were there when that was being filmed in Ridgewood. What a thrill to sit in a director's chair in the town that I used to roam as a little Brooklyn torpedo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it get any better, Charlie? I guess Charlie, I guess you have to die and go to heaven for it to get better, right?
Well, I can tell you a funny line from the screenwriter Steve Zalian, who adapted my book for the film. He said to me at one of the parties in connection with the release of the film, he said, "Charlie, when you think about it, you started at the top. You have no place to go now but down."
Wow. Yeah.
Which, when you look around, I started at the top. There's Marty, there's Bob, there's Steve, there's Al Pacino,
so
there's
Charlie,
Joe Pesci standing over there, there's Bobby Cannavale, and I hit it off with all of these people. I hesitate to say they loved me. We loved each other. There was warmth, there was camaraderie, it was just an amazing experience.
What an incredible story. Now, going back a little bit on Frank Sheeran, who was Frank Sheeran?
Well, Frank was came from a very religious upbringing. His father had studied for the priesthood for 5 years and then decided to leave. He was an iron worker and get married, and he was an amateur boxer. And Frank's mother went to 6 o'clock mass every morning of Frank's life. And so Frank grew up devout. He was an altar boy. He went to nothing but Catholic schools, but he was a bit of a character, a bit of a troublemaker in a way. And he ended up punching the priest and broke his jaw in a beef. And it's all this is a biography. I give all the details of Frank's early life in this book, and what he made out of it, considering how poor they were. They were very, very poor. They would have to move from place to place whenever it was time to pay the rent. They would have to move. And
wow. So then Frank grew up really hard scrabble, and his dad was
hard
tough.
scrabble.
His dad was pretty mean. What was his dad like?
Yeah,
beyond that,
his dad, when he felt that Frank was out of order, his dad would toss him the boxing gloves with the understanding that Frank could defend himself but wasn't allowed to hit back. And he would take quite a cuffing from his not very big father. His mother had the size. She was from Sweden. Frank was a shorter Irish guy, you know. But tough, the father. And Frank had to put up with physical abuse from him. His father worked at the school in which Frank broke the jaw of the headmaster, of the priest, with one punch. And when the father came home from school, the father already knew. He was like a handyman at the school, so he already knew what had happened. And he told Frank he broke his jaw, and he tossed the gloves at Frank. And Frank tossed them back and said, "You better get yourself another punching bag. You're not hitting me ever again." Well, he had just broken a grown man's jaw. You know?
Wow.
Yeah. And then the next thing that really happened, although the book talks about some amusing things and by joining a carnival, and then Frank went in the Army. He went into the airborne, and on a practice run, on an instructional run, he dislocated his collarbone. So they moved him from that into the military police, and he didn't like being a cop. He didn't like the military police. And in those days, you could transfer, if you wanted to transfer to the front lines, you could do so and transfer into the infantry. It was the only place you could select, and you would be guaranteed that you'd go to the unit that you wanted to go to. And he had a friend from the old neighborhood who was in the 45th Infantry Division, already in Sicily, and Frank asked for a transfer, was shipped to Sicily, and then began the fighting in Sicily. And his buddy couldn't believe that he had been so stupid as to do that. You know, here he was in the MP. Here he was going to ride out the war. Instead, he had 411 combat days. Tough guy.
Oh man! Later on, after the war concluded in Europe, he went to Austria with the Army. What was he doing in Austria?
Well, they put him back in the MP, and the Russian soldiers were raping the Austrian women. So American soldiers were sent there to stop that outrage, and he put a stop to it. He was a real gentleman. Nancy loved him. He loved chatting with him, and her favorite comment of his was, "I don't know if there's life after this, if we've got any more life after this, but I believe there is, and if I got a shot at it, I don't want to close the door." And He was explaining why he was confessing.
Quite a story. And I wanted to ask you something just quickly. Insights into cross-examination, Charlie. You've been an attorney for many, many years. You learned how to cross-examine. What are some of the insights you've gained about not only cross-examination, but about interrogation?
Well, cross-examination is just one form and one venue for the art of interrogation. But my very first teacher was a Wilmington detective by the name of Charlie Burke. And he had gotten a confession, and I can't think of the guy's name, but it's an easy name. He's on the tip of my tongue. But this guy had lived in an apartment, and he went down the fire escape and used a screwdriver to break into the apartment of an older woman who sold Bibles for a living. She was a Bible sales lady. And he broke in. She came home, and while he was rifling through her drawers for money, and she came home and surprised him, and he stabbed her to death with the screwdriver that he had used to get in. And Charlie Burke had gotten a confession from him. And I was so interested, and I had gotten interested in interrogation and confession as a result of the brand new TV show on CBS at the time. It had just come out in 1969, and it was 60 Minutes. And it was Mike Wallace using these techniques to get people to talk.
Amazing.
Yeah, and so it really was amazing. And so I asked
Charlie, are you going to tell me? I'm sorry.
What?
Go ahead. No, you go ahead. You're about to tell us. You're about to tell us.
So I asked Charlie Burke, how was it you get confessions? How did you get a confession from whatever his name was? And Berkey said to me, "They want to confess, Charles." Huh? I thought, that can't be. Nobody wants to confess. Is that just shorthand for I lean on them? What does that mean? But I tried it, and boy, do they. And as you know, in 1988, I had a book out based on 2 homicides that I solved through confession, through the art of interrogation. The book, as you know, was called and is called The Right to Remain Silent. It's a novel by Charles Brandt. Although it's a novel and it's fiction, it's based on the real James Clark attempted murder of a 5-year-old girl, choking her practically to death. She had petechial hemorrhages all over her face. He thought he had killed her. And the other crime that it's based on is the shooting in the head, just below the eye, of a Wilmington police officer named Jimmy Heatherton. And I was in charge of both of those investigations and solved them through interrogation. And in 1988, while I was practicing law, I wrote this book, The Right to Remain Silent. It did very well. And out of nowhere, I get this letter, and it was pro-law and order. And I get this letter from President Ronald Reagan.
Oh, wow.
Congratulating, commending me for my forthright effort on behalf of our citizenry. And I love the book. And my current publisher put it back in print about, what'd you say, Nan, about a month ago? Just about a month ago. So it's out there now with a brand new cover.
Oh, nice.
And it's got my buddy Stan Friedman, who was in charge of homicides, the robbery squad, which included homicides. And I learned a lot from all of these cats who were in the robbery squad. And Stan's badge adorns the cover of The Right to Remain Silent.
Wow. Hey, Charlie, was that, by the way, just a quick question, did Steerforth publish that, or was that another publisher?
No, it was Steerforth, and they asked me to do a new foreword, a preface, which I did, a 4-page preface for the new edition of the book, The Right to Remain Silent, from the author of I Heard You Paint Houses, The Irishman. Then in 1990, on the same topic, I wrote an article for Reader's Digest, and that's still around, called Let Our Police Take on the Drug Dealers. My position was that there were too many restrictions on our police out in the street, and we'll never get rid of the drug problem if we fight it by attacking Cali, Colombia, or attacking Mexico. The only way you'll get rid of the drug problem is by fighting it in the streets with your police. But if you're looking over their shoulder every minute of the day, you'll never get anywhere. Yeah. And so I'm still on that soapbox. But the book is an entertainment. It's not an instructional. The article was an instructional, although very entertaining, the Reader's Digest article. But the book is the story of a Wilmington police officer who's an ace interrogator and cross-examiner. It's modeled after me, using two of my over 50 cases. Somebody asked me, one of the reporters once asked me, how many did you handle? And I thought, I don't know. But by the time I got home from that interview, I had counted 56 in my head, And so I just say more than 50 homicides that I handled. I didn't necessarily take 50 of them to trial, probably getting to trial more like a couple of dozen, 24 or so, because you plea bargain some of them and whatever. And some of them you handle as an investigator, because I was an investigator, not merely a prosecutor. And that was a function of what our Attorney General at the time wanted from me. He wanted me to go to the scene of the crime in homicides and be there for the police, so that these new rules that are coming out all the time that affect police work, I could make sure the cops weren't making a mistake. And these cops, I loved them and they loved me, and they still talk about me. That was 1971,
Wow.
Dan, so then, we're still in touch.
So let's dive deep for a second with Frank Sheeran and Jimmy Hoffa. So they met up. It basically was because, as depicted in the film The Irishman, there was a phone call.
Accurately depicted, yeah.
Okay. So just tell us quickly about that. It's a fascinating thing.
Well, Frank had seen the movie On the Waterfront, and one day he was shooting the breeze with Russell, and he said, and he was a truck driver, and he was doing odd jobs for Russell, and that included the occasional killing. And he said to Russell, I'd like to get into union work. And Russell said, why don't you? And he said, well, there's a long line for shop steward. Everybody wants to be a shop steward. And Russell just listened. Frank naively didn't know how powerful Russell was. I will tell you that Russell had final script approval of the movie The Godfather.
How did that happen? Amazing.
It happened, and I learned about it at a talk I gave, because I do a lot of talks. Anybody wants a speaker, I'm your man. And at a talk I gave, and I told the story about the Johnny Fontaine character played by Al Martino, how he wanted the role of Johnny Fontaine, and he was told that he couldn't have it because Francis Ford Coppola wanted a real actor. He didn't want a singer. And so so Johnny Fontaine, or Al Martino, I should say, went to his boss, Russell, because he was under Russell Bufalino. He went to Russell, told Russell he wanted to be in the movie, and Russell Russell said, don't worry, the $50,000 that you lent the production staff, you'll get that back, and you'll be in the movie. And after the talk, a woman came up to me and introduced herself as Wanda Ruddy. Her husband, Al Ruddy, was the producer of the film. And she said to me, did you know that Russell had final script approval of The Godfather? And I said, no, but I know it now. So now it appears in my book,
Wow.
But it's a good source in Wanda Ruddy. Anyway, so Russell was, really big. And so Frank is, not thinking like that, but is just hoping that maybe someday he'll get in union work. Then fast forward a few days or whatever it was, he's sitting at the Friendly Tavern where Russell and Frank would hang out, and Russell goes to the telephone in those days before cell phones, and he returns to the table that Frank is at, and he says to Frank, somebody wants to talk to you. Say hello to your boss, Jimmy Hoffa.
Oh, wow.
So
what year was this, Charlie? Frank, what year was this?
This was 1957.
Oh, so Hoffa was already famous.
Famous, but not super famous. He was famous, but he had just taken over the Teamsters from Dave Beck, and he needed muscle, and he needed some people to be gotten rid of. And so he went to Russell for muscle. And Russell, in this scene that I'm telling you about that's in the movie, you see Russell handing him over to Hoffa, handing Frank over to Hoffa. And Hoffa said, first words ever uttered to Frank Sheeran by Jimmy Hoffa were, I heard you paint houses. And that means I heard you kill people. The paint is the blood that spatters on the walls and the floor. And Frank replied, I do my own carpenter work too, meaning I get rid of the bodies. And so it was a job interview, basically. And Hoffa told Frank to be in Detroit tomorrow. Russell passed him over an envelope with money in it to get there, to drive there. And then Frank went from working directly under Russell to working directly under Hoffa, but always having superior, always under the superior strength of Russell. And immediately they sent him to Chicago to kill a couple people.
Wow!
So that was his start. On loan from Russell. In fact, that's a line from from Frank to me. People, and Frank stammered, but people think that Frank lent me to Russell. It was the other way around. Russell lent me to Frank. So,
wow.
Yep, they have their ways.
Sure, and so
this
then
was just before. This was just before in the 1957. This was when the mafia was at its strongest in America, and little by little had that strength sapped away from it by first Bobby Kennedy, then Rudy Giuliani, in conjunction with, here's a book you don't mention. Hello.
Yes.
Lynn DeVecchio is another one I wrote. Lynn DeVecchio was the supervisory special agent of the organized crime unit in New York that went after the mafia in something called the Mafia Commission case. And Joe Pistone testified in that. He was the wrecking ball that helped bring the mafia down. The mafia has never been the same since Lynn DeVecchio and Joe Pistone and that crew that are known as the new untouchables. Somebody should grab that book and make a series out of it. It's incredible. Well, I wrote it.
Absolutely.
But,
Sure. It sounds like a tremendous work. Charlie, so now getting back to Frank Sheeran and his relationship with Jimmy Hoffa, it's 1957. The Teamsters are near their apogee. Lots of money coming in, tons of money coming in. How often would Frank commit a murder for Jimmy Hoffa?
He committed, it was hard to pin down. He settled on 25 to 30 between Jimmy and Russell. 25 to 30.
So it was,
some of them are
a couple of years.
Some of them are very, very well-known murders,
right.
And they're in the book. And the corroboration is in the book.
Yes, and tell us what are some of the bigger hits that Frank Sheeran carried out?
Well, we start out with a co-conspirator in the Jimmy Hoffa hit was a man named Sal Bergoglio, who worked for Tony Provenzano. And there was some suspicion in the many months after Hoffa disappeared, there was some suspicion that Sal Bergoglio was cooperating with the FBI. And so Frank and the redhead, who appears in the book, and there's a photo of him, Frank and the redhead John Francis from Ireland accosted Sal Bergoglio on the street and shot him in Little Italy. Shot him right on the street, on Mulberry Street.
Wow.
That was one.
What year was this, roughly?
This this would have been the disappearance was 75, and that was July 30th, 1975, and this would have been around March of 76. A few months later.
Wow.
A few months.
Just curious. Wow.
Sure.
Since
and
you
mentioned naysayers a little. You mentioned naysayers a little while ago. There's a character who goes around saying, without any proof, without the slightest shred of evidence, that Sal Bergoglio is really the trigger man, and he's the one that killed Hoffa, not Frank Sheeran.
Right.
But if you go to any book that this character wrote and look in the index and look up Sheeran, it's full of Frank Sheeran's involvement in the Hoffa murder. That was then. That was years ago. This guy wrote that. But you're talking about people, and there's a little handful of them, who have never so much as handled a shoplifting case. They don't know anything about homicide investigation, and they're people like it just. I gotta mention her name.
Go ahead.
Peggy Noonan, the speechwriter. Peggy Noonan, the speechwriter. She's friends with some guy who's claiming something, and so she backs him up. And she has no clue what she's talking about. She's never
Right.
never even sat in a one day of a murder trial, much less.
Well, just
Well,
listen.
and
Since
they
we just Charlie.
they make me angry. So you caught
Sure,
me.
Charlie.
You
One
caught
thing.
me,
I mean,
amigo.
since we
Venting.
right, I got you. Well, listen. Joe Pistone comes to mind. Concerning the naysayers, and Joe, I didn't know this. The amazing connection he makes to Santos Trafficante, Balistieri, in Milwaukee, part of the Chicago outfit. But about Russel Bufalino, that's news to me. I never knew that. So I'm wondering, what does Joe Pistone say about the Hoffa murder?
You can find it on the book jacket. He says, he gave us a quote. He gave us a blurb for the book jacket, and he said if the mobsters that Charlie Brandt and Frank Sheeran rubbed up against in their years together had any idea what Frank was confessing to Charlie, they'd have both been whacked.
Oh wow! So he knew so many secrets.
Yeah, and I knew that. If, God forbid, Frank Sheeran was sitting around with one of the members of the Bufalino crime family and up there in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and just casually said something like, I might be telling that Charlie Brandt too much. Bang.
Whoa. Goodbye.
Bang goes Charlie Brandt. And then when the book was coming out in 2004, Billy D'Elia, who I mentioned didn't like me, big Billy D'Elia, 6'3", the boss of the family, now that Russell was dead, he got a message to my wife. He had somebody send her a message, an email that we know, that said Billy is not happy with Charlie.
Oh my!
And that went on a Friday. It was Memorial Day weekend. The book was coming out that coming Monday, Memorial Day. It was what they call embargoed. When you embargo a book and you build suspense, and now it's out. Well, it was not out yet. It was not out yet over that Memorial Day weekend, but on Monday it was coming out. And I said to Nancy, honey, when he reads the book, he will discover that his name is not mentioned anywhere in the book. Frank cautioned me and Nancy knew that when we were working on the book, when I was working on the book and interviewing him, don't say anything about that guy, and don't use his name. And that was Big Billy D'Elia's not being used. And so Nancy said, look, I just feel a lot more comfortable if Frank was still alive. And I said, well, everything's going to be all right, because he's not going to go out of his way to cause a problem.
Right, and so he wasn't mentioned.
He was not mentioned. Then he goes and becomes a government witness, cooperating witness. He gets arrested. He gets like a 20-year sentence, and they reduce it to 9 years. And he gets out because the first question they asked him, the FBI asked him, was what happened to Hoffa.
Wow.
And he told them to read my book.
And so do you have anything to do with it?
And as the underboss of the family, he knew everything, but he was not involved in it.
Right.
And he said, to them, to the FBI, sometimes you can believe everything you read.
Well,
so he endorsed the book, and then we took that sentence and made a blurb out of that. Former boss of the Bufalino crime family. Sometimes you can believe everything you read.
So Charlie, what I wanted to ask you is that let's go to that fateful date, 1975.
Thanks for tuning in to Quorum Radio, an initiative of ocasomedia.net.